Welcome to the Rational Nationalist. Now, we might curse our boss or try to pin every problem in society on the current president, and I'm old enough to remember the Thanks Obama meme, so this is by no means confined to the current administration. But how much responsibility do these people really bear for our current state of misery? How much personal control do they have over, well, anything? Are they the all powerful, all being elite some of us make them out to be? Or simply people who sit around smoking scotch and drinking cigars or whatever while accomplishing nothing and reaping the rewards by exploiting the working man below them, as so many others seem to think? A leader is only as good as his word. Literally, a leader isn't anything until somebody decides to act on his command, or even a lack of command. Famously, King Henry II once said, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" He meant this as nothing more than an exclamation of frustration, but foreign knights took it seriously enough to kill Sir Thomas Becket, creating all sorts of headaches for the king. Crapopolis and Schlub did a pretty good bit on it this season about the tension around how seriously to take the king's word, and that's basically how all this works for anyone familiar with the bit. That being said, if King Henry II intended or meant it differently, then history would read that King Henry II executed or murdered Thomas Becket. But obviously that's not literally true. He didn't personally stick the knife in. Likewise, Teddy Roosevelt didn't really dig out that much of the Panama Canal, and I doubt Ramses did much sculpting on the Sphinx. Yet they all get credit for it. Why? The answer seems simple enough. They told people to do it. Except that's also not really true, is it? Sure, Henry II may have said it directly, but my guess is that Ramses probably told an architect, who told a site manager, who told a slave driver, who told a slave what to actually do. You get the point. When any leader does something, there are a number of intermediate steps, each of which dramatically increases the amount of ways that things can go differently, either good or bad, from what the leader intended or could have accomplished themselves, which, as we've seen, isn't much. This is what makes a leader a leader. They can bring people together for a common cause, organize them constructively, and motivate them to keep rowing in the same direction. At least theoretically, that's what a leader does. Sometimes it's whoever happened to be born in the right place at the right time, and sometimes this works out fine. There's an uncle in Mrs. Maisel who runs the family's very successful company, whose entire job is walking around asking his employees if everything's all good. He doesn't do much of anything, and yet the company still runs because the people beneath him all know what to do already and are competent. Or so it seems. I haven't seen the ending of the show. The point is that, in a lot of ways, good leadership is hiring good people and letting them do their jobs, which allows Ron Cadillac at the top to spend his Monday mornings golfing, bugging his wife, or whatever else rich people like to do once they've successfully delegated the actual work. Delegation is our theme of the day. We've already talked in the past about how every layer of bureaucracy adds its own interests and the possibility, or surface area, though that's a little more technical than I'd like to get, but the possibility for perverse incentives and mission drift. However, delegation also allows for a lot more to get done. We wouldn't have the Sphinx if Ramses had had to lay every brick itself or himself. I think the Sphinx is made out of bricks. It's really not my field, but whatever construction method they were using, Ramses probably was at home with his harem, not out under the Egyptian sun laboring away. This delegation also has other implications, particularly for those of us interested in governance and political systems, and especially if you like living in a constitutional society responsive to the will of the voters. As is our wont, let's start from the ground and build up, or in this case, start at the top with the king in a simple monarchy and work down from there. So congratulations, you're now the king of Nowheresville, and it's your first day on the job. What do you do? My guess is that the first thing you do is try to figure out where you are and what exactly you're king of, right? I mean, fair play, I just pulled you out of whatever job you're currently doing and dropped you into this fictional world of my own creation. But literally, what do you do? Do you just go outside, ride around shouting, "Hey, where all my Nowheresville peeps at?" I mean, probably, but let's say it doesn't have to get that far. You leave your room in the castle that I've now given you, and several advisors are waiting your every command. You tell one of them to go get your morning coffee, vodka, if you're Peter the Great, tea, whatever else you like, and you get to work with the rest of the advisors. You tell one of them to go out and ride around like reverse Paul Revere and figure out what resources you have to work with. Good news, they've already done that. For the record, this is called making a population or nation legible, and is basically what a census accomplishes today, and is exactly what William the Conqueror did with the Domesday Book following the Norman Conquest. The first thing he did was send people out to see exactly what he had conquered. Anyway, you now have enough information to decide that you'd like to build a bridge, since that's a pretty simple hypothetical and you've already done the census. You order a bridge built, sit back, and enjoy the rest of your day because building a bridge seems like a pretty good accomplishment for just a single day. The problem is the bridge isn't actually built, you've just said some words. Hey, you, go build a bridge. Let's see what actually happens while you're frolicking in the palace without a care in the world, other than, keeping your head on your shoulders and your ass on the throne. Architect Andy, one of your advisors, goes to draw up a blueprint, but where do you want the bridge? There are several legitimate options. Additionally, how big? Are we talking like one-way little rickety thing, or did you want something like the Golden Gate Bridge that's going to be both a monument and functional? Or maybe even you just want something monumental. Leaders have certainly done crazier things than building bridges to nowhere. Andy could ask you. But maybe Andy realizes that this bridge could be his legacy, and he runs with the Golden Gate Bridge idea, putting you well over budget, bankrupting you, and forcing you to eat nothing but gruel to get your budget back in line. But hey, everyone will now remember Andy's bridge 100 years ago. By the way, while he was building his bridge, he put his initials everywhere, so it's now Andy's Bridge. I guess good for you. The bridge is built. However, these types of perverse incentives we've discussed on the episode Inside the Mind of a Bureaucrat, so we'll just assume Andy's operating in good faith and comes to you. At first, with these questions. But if you've ever had a kid keep asking why, you know there's a limit to how much you want him to keep checking in. You appreciate him not bankrupting you, but at the same time, you really don't need to be woken up at 3 a.m. to decide between off-white and eggshell white for the highway striping. There's a question in every organization as to how much to delegate these types of decisions, and this question occurs at every level of the organization. The slave must decide when asking a question gets him a beating and when it saves him one. The slave driver needs to feel out his site manager's style, and so forth. These delegations can be formalized in rules or informal or some combination of the both, but they always occur. This is what they mean when they say empowering employees. Sometimes it's to allow employees to have more say over the decisions in their lives. Sometimes maybe management just doesn't want to make every little decision. So they empower you as to what color shirt to wear, for example. It should be noted that there's a Goldilocks issue here, where there is no objective right or wrong amount of delegation that should occur. It depends very much on personal preference in the situation, such as some people learn better with close instruction, and others learn by being allowed to explore themselves. Certain people desire and may need more or less oversight. So, in practice, there's very much a feeling out process between manager and employee. However, I do have some general thoughts, and since that's the whole point of having a podcast, I'll share them here. First off, competence is king. Scratch that. Loyalty and trustworthiness are really king. You have to be able to trust that people are actually going to go out and make a good faith effort to follow the rules of leadership. But even when they do, things just go better when people are competent enough to take care of themselves. In terms of governance, however, which is ultimately kind of the point of its show, it does have its good and its bad points, so let's talk about these in turn. And to be clear and specific, I am talking about dividing or delegating decision-making authority within the government itself. I am not talking about the separation of power between the branches of government. What I'm talking about occurs independently in each branch, as the president's authority is delegated to cabinet and lower-level bureaucrats, primarily would be the best example. Also occurs a little bit in SCOTUS's judicial authority, as that gets delegated to lower court judges and staffers, and so forth. Bringing it back to our simple hypothetical, we're currently working with Andy the architect to build a bridge, which brings us to the first advantage of delegation and bureaucracy: expertise. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know how to build a bridge, at least not one I'd want to walk on. A plank across a creek is about the best I can do. You know who does know how to build a bridge? Andy. He's an architect, so theoretically he should be able to build a bridge. If not, we should be looking for a better architect. This is where a good leader defers to his bureaucrats and why good faith is so important. You can see how easy it would be for Andy to hide his own interests within his advice, for example, to encourage the construction of a more prestigious bridge, one that requires less work on his part, or suggest that he needs more employees than necessary to carry out the construction. And of course, this snowball keeps rolling downhill, as Andy is going to have to hire builder Bethany and so forth, each of whom can hide their own interests as expert advice, or substitute their own policy preferences for that of the ruler, with or without notifying the ruler. We'll discuss that more later, but for now let's just move on quickly to another advantage of the bureaucracy: added reach and the wisdom of crowds. We'll pass over these quickly since they're pretty self-explanatory. Many hands make light work, so the more people you have working on your behalf, the more you can get done. But of course you have to trust them to actually do as they're instructed and not go off drinking, whoring, gambling, or pursuing their own agenda within the organization, such as playing politics to get promoted, building their own little fiefdom, or trying to leverage their position for a better job elsewhere. Unfortunately, as king of nowhere, you do have to hire people to do your dirty work, and people will always suck in their own unique ways. Anyone who's ever tried to coach kids can tell you that it's one thing to tell them what needs to be done, but it's another thing entirely to get them to actually follow through and do it. Adults aren't really that much different. This is where the sword starts to get a little double-edged, so to speak. Delegating is clearly efficient. You can get 5 times as much done if you have 5 people you can delegate to, and if they, in turn, have 5 more people they can delegate to, the amount of work you can get done continues to increase, and you basically have modern governments, companies, and any other organization. That's basically how leadership works. You delegate to people who delegate, and so on, depending on the size of the organization. However, it's also where inefficiencies drift in. We discussed on previous podcasts how each person to whom you delegate has their own set of incentives, such as growing their department, protecting themselves, commonly known as CYA or covering your ass, and their own personal agendas. What's to keep them following the leader? Why should any of these people do what the leader says, especially since they didn't vote for him and he's not their president, or the boss who's just a Nepo baby, or the leader of your local drug gang? Well, that one may be obvious. Ethically, the answer for following these people is clear. It's your job. And since people are always ethical all the time, there's no problem, right? In the real world, incentives guide behavior, as Charlie Munger always emphasized, and so incentives are what keep people rowing in the same direction, i.e. following the leader. In dictatorships, and the private sector generally, the incentive is clear. Do your job or lose your head, or get fired. Sounds simple, right? The problem is that it's not always that simple, especially because most of us don't live in or want to live in a dictatorship under these types of conditions. Even under these conditions, Game of Thrones taught us that you can't exactly go around chopping heads off without consequences. Those heads have families, friends, and so forth, some of whom might lead a rebellion or start a war. For example, Architect Andy might be the son of your most powerful landowner, such that removing him might threaten a revolution, or at least cause a delay in how quickly the nobility pay their taxes. If this is the case, how much is Andy really incentivized to follow orders and operate in good faith versus pursue his own agenda of self-aggrandizement? Furthermore, remember those constitutional systems we spoke so highly of previously and frequently? They work precisely because they distribute power instead of concentrating it in one person. That's generally good, but those same protections that protect people from tyranny also give them potential cover to pursue their own interests at the cost of the common good. For example, Architect Andy might ignore orders to contain costs, knowing that the burden of covering overages is going to end up falling on other departments. But 100 years from now, everyone will still know about Andy's bridge. Let's fast forward a little, out of our simple monarchy. We now know that Andy is doing his own thing, spending out the wazoo, trying to undermine other departments, and generally just being that dude who knows that he can't get fired, and so he just does whatever he wants all the time. So you fire him anyway, figuring at this point you'll just eat whatever political fallout comes from it, because this guy has to go, and since we fast forwarded, head chopping literally is off the block. As I said, you're no longer king, but now you're the president of a modern corporation, an administrative state that is a government, or most modern institutions. You tell him he's fired, and he laughs in your face. You can't just say you're fired like in the good old days, so you have to file the paperwork with HR, so you go and do that, but HR has a whole review process. They don't want to get sued, So you actually have to establish cause for the termination, and you're told that him being a complete jackass doesn't count as cause. You need something concrete like a history of complaints or written reprimands. Additionally, you'll need the approval of his direct supervisor, and his union will have a week to request a hearing. His direct supervisor, by the way, is a holdover from the past administration or dislikes you for whatever reason and wants to see you fail, so he's going to withhold his approval. Now you have to fire the direct supervisor, which involves its own set of hoops, and pretty soon you're the bureaucratic version of Joe Pesci in Casino digging graves in the Vegas desert all day, as the number of bodies you have to keep firing just keeps piling up. Notice that a lot of these rules are good and put in place to protect employees and prevent abuse from management. Often they do just that. However, when bureaucrats become entrenched like this, it alters the incentives to encourage them to pursue their own preferences and interests instead of those of the organization, knowing that leadership of the organization can do little to punish them for it. Finally, we've been using a simple model, but remember how many layers deep organizations such as Western administrative states run. With one or two people, you might be able to identify where the logjam is or who the holdup or the obstructor is, but remember the President of the United States appoints some insane number of officials, and that's just the tippy top of the U.S. federal bureaucratic iceberg. Aside from the top-level officials, most people responsible for carrying out the policies of the elected officials, that is, the ones the people actually voted for, are career bureaucrats protected by bureaucratic rules and regulations. What are their incentives to pursue the policies of the people elected to do the job versus their own political preferences? Remember, elections are intended to determine policies, but if the people actually carrying out their policies are emboldened and encouraged to substitute their own policy preferences in favor of those of elected officials, elections become meaningless. Furthermore, those who resist following the policies of the people elected cannot be removed from power without extreme difficulty, and are numerous enough that they can hide their obstruction in the crowd. At this point, you don't have democracy, you have a bureaucratic oligarchy or government of the institutional hive mind. Thank you for joining us on The Rational Nationalist. I'm your host, Lee Ellis, signing off.